So I want us to return to a former story that also speaks of an encounter with fire. I want to return to that story of Moses' encounter with the burning bush. It is among one of the first stories where we hear the people of the Judaic Christian tradition wrestling with what it means to have a face-to-face with God. Because keep in mind that within that tradition, there was a sense as well that God was always out there, big, powerful, something to be feared, somebody in control. But something shifts when Moses encounters the burning bush, and that is that God is suddenly revealed on the ground, wanting a face-to-face, wanting a partnership. And I think at the heart of that story is this: the mystery that we call God is longing for oneness with us. And once we experience that oneness, we are then returned to the world on a mission, and the mission is always having to do with reconciliation. So you recall Moses, who ran from his people, ran from a really bad situation, and suddenly the mystery we call God is showing up in the flames and saying, it's time to go home, and it's time to mediate reconciliation and liberation. I think that's interesting because I think something that's at the heart of that story picks up again in the story that is told in the book of Acts. I'm going to take you back to one more mythic story. This time we're going a little further back to the book of Genesis. Traditionally in churches, if they're using the lectionary, that is the Old Testament lesson that goes with the New Testament lesson that goes with the Psalm and the Epistle, on this day, the two stories that are told together are the story about the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11, side by side the story from Acts. I'm just going to remind us briefly about that story because I think it also provides an interesting contrast. So the story of the Tower of Babel was a typical human story. A bunch of guys get together and want to build a really, really, really big tower. Isn't that... Joyce thinks that's funny. So that they can be really, really important, all right? So as the story goes, God looks down and goes, oh boy, this is going to go bad really soon, because that's what happened when a bunch of guys get together to build something really big to make them really important. And so God... who also the Jewish people understood to have an amazing sense of humor, decides that he's just going to give everybody a different language so they can't communicate with one another, so they can't go on building this monstrosity. I think at the heart of that story is we'll always get in trouble if our egos are driving the conversation. But I think the other part is when our egos drive the conversation, we're always going to be speaking a different language. Or even if we're speaking the same language, we're going to be completely divided. So then, fast forward, this story that speaks about the day of Pentecost, it picks up on that mythic story about the burning bush, where it's like fire shows up again, and there's this even bigger reconciliation. So we hear that the believers then go out from where they were kind of hiding scared, waiting for directions, out into the streets of Jerusalem where there are people from everywhere in the empire. And the image that is created is this image of people are all speaking different languages, but it's different this time. They're all understanding one another. So it's an antidote to Babel, and it's picking up on the burning bush story, that the mystery that we call God wants to be among us for the purpose of reconciling us to one another, of pulling together all of those pieces, breaking down all of those divisions, so that we become one within the mystery. So then fast forward, and this is another story I've told you before, but fast forward and we have the Emperor Constantine, who decides that in order for there to be peace in the empire, he wants everybody to have the same religion and believe the same thing. So whereas all of these little Christian communities spread throughout Asia, kind of were all doing their own thing based on a teaching of love and inclusivity, Constantine said, you guys quite aren't all on the same page, and I want you all on the same page. And so there went that kind of vision of diversity, right? We all get to be unique with our own languages and our own unique gifts, knowing that in our uniqueness, we will serve the mystery we call God. But suddenly it was, no, you've all got to be the same, and you've all got to believe the same thing, and you've all got to toe the line. And as soon as that happens, well, let me ask you, what happens to spirit? So, I think what we had was the early Christian communities went from being these communities moved by spirit, caught up in wind and fire, permitted and encouraged to live out of their diversity, to then the Church of Constantine, one community, under one God, under one creed. And then what did the Church of Constantine start doing? Creating really big buildings. And then we called that church. Huge contrast, isn't it? And so there was a season when we worshipped our buildings. And people would say, oh, that church, it's down there. You know, the 4 square walls put together with bricks and mortar. That's the church. So I'll tell you what. I don't like telling stories, but... all right, so I'll tell this story. So I have a friend who serves a church in Kingston, and it's a really big church. And there's another church in Kingston of the same denomination about 3 blocks away. It's an even bigger church. And both of these churches are a little concerned about the future, thinking they may not have enough money to hold on to their Towers of Babel, if you know what I mean. And so they're starting to dream and scheme and think, you know what? If we got together and worked together and we could maybe save one another's Towers of Babel. Yeah. We'll just kind of consolidate all our staff, and we'll have 1 minister and 1 secretary, and then they called it a 2-point charge. So rather than just 1 Tower of Babel under 1 ministry, we'll have 2. And then we get to hold on to every single brick and all of the mortar. And if we have to lose some people doing ministry in the middle, well, we've got our towers. We get to keep our church. So, what is it that the event of Pentecost invites us to remember? The first thing it invites us to remember is that at the heart of our tradition is an invitation to wholeness. It's an invitation to reconciliation with one another and with the mystery that we call God. And I think that if we were to rewrite the Tower of Babel story today, and I think that the mystery we call God is probably laughing about this right now, the mystery we call God is saying, oh my God, look down there, we've got those Presbyterian churches and those United churches and those Catholic churches, and look at all those churches, and well, you know what? What happens if we get to the point where no one can actually afford any of those buildings, and we might end up with one community again? Wouldn't that be interesting? I'm not sure that the mystery we call God is as unhappy as those people in the churches that these buildings may need to go. Here's, I think, the second thing we have to remember. We got it wrong when we determined, or let's put it this way, the priests who wrote the book of Leviticus and then was picked up in Hebrews, etc., determined that holiness meant being set apart. But we got that wrong. Holiness or wholeness can only take place when all of the pieces come back together. That's probably bigger than one sentence, but I'll leave that with you, all right? The next thing I think it's important to recognize about this story, and this is most important, is that in this vision, we are not called to abandon our uniqueness. We are not called to abandon the parts of us that make us different. We are called to share our own unique fire with a deep conviction. It is that diversity that will reflect the mystery that we call God. Not everyone being the same. So, Anne Ireland, who's responsible for the work on the walls today, she's a remarkable woman. She's battling cancer right now. It's a battle she may not win. But boy, is she ever winning other battles. Found her yesterday. She's still got her little pick in. She's doing chemo, but she had a brush in hand, and she just is going for it. And she said, you know, Lynn, she goes, I don't know where this journey is going to end. But right now, I've just decided somehow this illness has burned away all of my fear. And I'm just letting my light shine. And I know that some people think my light is really wacko. Like all they have to do is look at my work. But she said, I am so happy right now being able to finally let go of all of my inhibitions about the ways I didn't fit and the things my mother didn't think I did right, etc., and just put my vision on a canvas. Wow. I hope you'll meet her early next month. So I want you to imagine that square in the middle of Jerusalem where the diversity would have just blown your mind. And think of that as kingdom. And nobody's being put in boxes, and nobody's a Christian, and no one's a Buddha. Everybody's different. And everyone is belonging to one another. And I think that what we need to remember is that our tradition insists that we show up in all of our fullness. Whereas I know that many of us grew up in churches where we felt the need to hide those things that didn't fit. Or, quite frankly, those people who didn't feel that any of their pieces fit, they just went out the door. Because there was a message, maybe it was only subtle, that this was a place for certain kinds of people, good people, and there were certain parts of you or parts of your family or parts of your neighborhood that just didn't belong here. And that is so contrary to the teachings of Jesus, and it's so contrary to the image that is created on this day. So when we allow ourselves to be shaped by wind and fire and not by bricks and mortar, I think the community we create looks a little bit more like the kitchen party that I had at my house last night, where everybody brings their own stuff, everyone brings their own instrument, their own story, their own voice, and they just share. It was Pentecost in my house last night. So let me rewrite this passage from the book of Acts for you today. I think it's a story that you'll recognize. A group of weary believers gathered together in 2007, wondering if they had a future together. Wondering about the deficit and their buildings that needed repair, and their ages that were getting older, and their children who had disappeared. But they crafted a vision driven by curiosity and creativity and courage, and using the teaching around compassion as their rudder. And they went out into the town of Picton. And they connected with artists and with musicians and with vulnerable families. And while they all spoke different languages, they became a circle of friends. And before you knew it, they weren't just Presbyterians, but there were some United folk and Catholics and even Anglicans, and Buddhists and seekers and doubters and addicts. And together, they continued to seek further and further connections with one another and the world around them. This is how the Christian tradition understands the journey towards wholeness and healing. The Spirit is constantly breaking down barriers, welcoming outsiders, and reconciling that which has been separated both within us and among us. And believe me when I say that this movement rarely looks like church.